One company controlled half the world's trade. It had its own army, its own laws, its own prisons, and almost nobody voted for it. At its peak, the East India Company was bigger than most countries. It collected taxes from 90 million people. It fought wars. It moved governments. And it did all of this for one reason only: profit. But here is the part that most people never learn. The real story is not about ships and spices. It is about power. About who has it, who loses it, and what happens when a business becomes bigger than the state. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1600. England is a small island nation trying to compete with the great empires of Spain and Portugal. Both countries already control the most profitable trade routes in the world, the spice routes of Asia. Spices in the 1600s were not just flavor. They were value. Pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, these things were worth more than gold in European markets. A ship full of spices could make a merchant richer than most kings. So a group of London merchants had an idea. They would pool their money together, share the risk, and send ships to Asia. They called their new organization the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. We call it the East India Company. Queen Elizabeth I gave them something extraordinary on December 31st, 1600. She gave them a monopoly. This is called a charter. It means an official document that gives a company or a person the exclusive legal right to operate in a specific area. No other English business could trade in Asia. Only them. From that moment, the East India Company was not just a business. It was a business protected by the power of the crown. The early years were difficult. The Portuguese and Dutch already controlled most Asian ports. The company lost ships. It lost men. It nearly went bankrupt several times. But slowly, carefully, the company found its footing. It built small trading posts called factories. Here, factory does not mean a place where things are manufactured. In this context, it means a trading post, a base where merchants called factors lived and worked. These factories were in places like Surat in India, Bantam in Indonesia, and later, a small fishing village on the southeast coast of India. The company called it Madras. Today, we call it Chennai. And something interesting happened in these factories. The company started to make rules. It created courts to judge disputes. It hired guards to protect its warehouses. It wrote contracts that local traders had to follow. The company was not just trading. It was building a small, unofficial government wherever it went. Now here is where the story gets complicated and more interesting. By the mid-1600s, the company was making enormous amounts of money, mainly from cotton textiles from India, which Europeans loved. The problem was competition from other European companies, especially the Dutch East India Company, and from local rulers who sometimes blocked trade or changed the rules. The company's directors back in London made a decision that changed everything. They decided the company needed its own military force. This is called vertical integration. It means when a company controls not just its core product, but also the systems around it, in this case, the security and enforcement of trade itself. Instead of depending on local rulers or the English Navy, the company would protect itself. By 1700, the East India Company had its own private army. Thousands of soldiers, paid by a corporation. Think about that for a moment. Business with an army. The 1700s were the century that transformed the company from a trading business into something much darker. India at this time was ruled by the Mughal Empire, one of the richest empires in human history. The Mughals had art, architecture, science, and enormous agricultural wealth. The city of Murshidabad in Bengal was reportedly wealthier than London. The company had trading rights in Bengal, a rich, fertile region in northeastern India. They paid taxes to the Nawab, the regional ruler, and generally followed local rules. Then, in 1756, a new Nawab came to power. His name was Siraj-ud-Daulah. He was young, ambitious, and suspicious of the growing power of the East India Company within his territory. He was right to be suspicious. The company, led on the ground by a man named Robert Clive, made a secret deal with some of the Nawab's own generals. They promised these generals power and money if they helped remove Siraj. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, the company's army fought the Nawab's forces. But several of the Nawab's top commanders simply refused to fight. They had already been paid to step aside. The battle lasted a few hours. The company won. And Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, fell under company control. This was not a war. It was a hostile takeover. That means when one party forcibly takes control of another against their will, using power rather than agreement. And it was just the beginning. After Plassey, the company did something that had never been done before in the history of business. It became a tax collector. The Mughal system gave regional powers the right to collect taxes from farmers and traders. This right was called the Diwani. In 1765, the company acquired the Diwani rights to Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, three of the richest provinces in India. They now collected taxes from millions of people. And they kept the money. But here is what makes this particularly dark. The company did not invest this money back into Bengal. They used it to buy Indian goods, textiles, silk, spices, which they then sold back in Europe at enormous profit. In other words, they taxed Indian people, used that money to buy Indian products, and then sold those products to Europeans. India was paying for its own exploitation. Economists who study this period use the term drain of wealth. It means the systematic transfer of resources from one region to another through political and economic control, with no fair exchange in return. Some historians estimate that the company extracted the equivalent of trillions of modern dollars from India during this period. If you find this kind of economic history fascinating, Michael's Mindcast has more stories like this one, stories about how money, power, and history connect in ways nobody tells you in school. And then came the famine. In 1769 and 1770, drought hit Bengal. Crops failed. People needed food. But the company continued to collect taxes. Even as people starved, the tax collectors came. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly one-third of the entire population of Bengal. 10 million people. And the company's response? They actually raised taxes the following year to compensate for reduced revenue from a smaller population. This is the dark secret. Not just greed, not just colonialism, but a system so focused on shareholder returns, that means profits paid back to the investors who own the company, that it continued to function as a profit machine even while millions of people died around it. The company's investors in London received dividends that year. Back in England, not everyone was comfortable with what was happening. Some politicians were horrified. Edmund Burke, a famous British politician, gave passionate speeches in Parliament about the crimes of the company. He called it a state within a state, a private power that had grown beyond all democratic control. And he was right. By the 1780s, the East India Company controlled more territory in Asia than the British government did. It had more soldiers than the British Army. And it answered officially only to its shareholders. This created a major political problem. The company was nominally, in name, a British institution, but its actions, the wars, the famines, the tax extraction, were creating enemies for Britain across Asia. Other European powers were watching. Local resistance movements were growing. Something had to change. In 1784, the British government passed the India Act. This gave the government new powers to oversee and control the company. This is called regulation. It means official rules created by a government to control the behavior of a business or industry. But even regulation was not enough, because the company did not slow down. The early 1800s saw the company at its most powerful. Under governors like Richard Wellesley and later Lord Dalhousie, the company fought war after war to expand its territory. There was a strategy Dalhousie used called the doctrine of lapse. This meant that if an Indian ruler died without a direct biological heir, the company would simply absorb his territory. Adopted children did not count. Widows did not count. Local tradition did not count. Kingdom after kingdom was absorbed. Awadh in northern India was one of the last major territories to fall in 1856. The people of Awadh had a king. They had a culture, a court, a music tradition, a way of life. The company took all of that and turned it into a revenue-generating province. And then the company made its biggest mistake. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the company's army, called sepoys, from the Hindi word sipahi meaning soldier, began to revolt. The causes were complex. Religious grievances, anger about the doctrine of lapse, resentment at British cultural interference. But the spark was a practical one. New rifle cartridges arrived. The soldiers had to bite the cartridges to load their rifles. Rumors spread that the cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat, offensive to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. The revolt spread rapidly. Soldiers in merit killed their British officers and marched to Delhi. Within weeks, large parts of northern India were in open rebellion. The British called it the Indian Mutiny. Indians call it the First War of Independence. Both names tell you something about who was writing history. The company survived the revolt with help from the British Army, but the revolt ended it. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control of India. Queen Victoria became, officially, Empress of India. The company was dead, but its consequences lived on for nearly another century in the form of the British Raj, the direct colonial rule of the Indian subcontinent. So what do we take from all of this? The East India Company started as a group of merchants trying to make money. There is nothing unusual about that. But through a combination of political protection, military force, and relentless focus on profit, it became something the world had never seen before. A corporation with sovereign power. And the lesson is both historical and deeply modern. Because the questions the company raises about how much power a business should have, about who controls corporations when they become larger than governments, about the relationship between profit and harm, these questions did not disappear in 1858. We still ask them today. Every time a technology company becomes larger than most economies. Every time a corporation operates across borders and avoids national laws. Every time we ask who is responsible when a business causes suffering, we are asking the same question that Edmund Burke asked in Parliament in 1785. Who controls the controllers? The East India Company did not invent capitalism. It did not invent empire. But it showed the world what happens when those two things combine, when a business has no limit, no accountability, and no constraint except the price of its own shares. And the people who paid the price were not the shareholders in London. They were the farmers in Bengal, the kings of Awadh, the soldiers in Meerut. The company's secret was never really a secret. It was just a truth that nobody in power wanted to say out loud. Profit, without accountability, becomes a form of violence. If this kind of deep, uncomfortable history is something you want more of, Michael's Mindcast goes exactly there. The stories that explain how the world we live in was actually built. So here is the question I want to leave you with. The East India Company was shut down by a government that decided one corporation had too much power. Today, some technology and financial companies have revenues larger than the GDP of most countries. They operate globally. They shape information, money, and politics. Do you think we have learned the lessons of the East India Company? Or are we watching the same story begin again, just with different names? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every single one.